labai džiaugiuosi, kad galiu šiandien pristatyti Iryną Starovoit, Ukrainos poetė, eseistė, literatūros kritikė, Ukrainos katalikų universiteto profesorė. I'm very glad to introduce Iryna Starovoit, who's Ukrainian poet, essayist, literary critic, and also a Ukrainian Catholic University professor, to give a talk called Bulletproof Culture and the Art of Endurance, Counter Catastrophe Perspective. Pranešimas vadinasi Neperšaunama kultūra ir ištvermės menas prieš katastrofinę perspektyvą. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Thank you, all of you gathered together. And I know that this event has been in preparation for almost a year. I know that my talk has been finished and sent here in the beginning of August, actually. And it was...
Can I translate? Žinau, kad šitas, ačiū labai, kad mane pakvietėte, žinau, kad šitas Nidos forumas buvo ilgai ruošiamas. You were saying you were preparing a presentation.
Sending mid-August.
Šitą pranešimą rengiau vidury rugpjūčio.
We live in the times when things change very rapidly and irreversibly. I really didn't know whether my talk will have any sense in a month from then, but I think it still has.
Mes gyvename tokiu laiku, kai viskas labai greitai keičiasi ir nebuvo aišku, ar po kelių mėnesių nuo rugpjūčio mano pranešimas dar bus relevantiškas, bet manau, kad dar vis.
So let's begin. Bulletproof Culture and the Art of Endurance, a Counter Catastrophe Perspective. If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? As it goes in the Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. When does something become unbearable? When it becomes too painful and repulsive to endure any longer. That is, this something didn't just happen once. It has tested our endurance, physical and psychological. It hurt, tormented, disrupted normalcy, forced us to stand at attention, then clenched into a fist that something crossed all boundaries, manifested and engaged all reserves of our strengths, and now has exhausted our capacity. Imagine, nothing remains. Neither your house, nor your city, nor your former life. And so it is for millions of people all at once. Simultaneous erasure. All that a person and community can hope for in the unbearable is that it has an end and a limit. Не можеш так буть. This cannot be, as Tychina, the poet, said with exclamation mark in Kiev during Russian army massacre and plunder of Ukrainian capital back in 1919. Where there is suffering, there is also something that must stop it. The needle's eye of death each time finds its red thread and strings along. We can experience ordinary, banal, statistical encounters with evil and wartime losses, but we also experience countless previously undescribed ones, not passed down from previous generations. We know too well here that cultural memory in our part of the world often stands for the archive, non-existent, manipulated, destroyed. Especially when written records and those who fought for justice are systematically destroyed, cultural oral traditions become the crucial vessels of historical truth. The mothers, aunts, and grandmothers who raised children carry these stories forward through generations, ensuring that suppressed histories survive in memory until they can eventually emerge into the full light of recognition and validation. There is no other Ukraine, Taras Shevchenko wrote in 1845 in his poem addressed to the dead, the living, and the unborn countrymen, when Ukraine was not to be found on the political maps of the time. Hence, Ukrainians had no other choice but to fight for their homeland and to win. This is an epic, transformative story. Your homeland is under attack, you must defend it. Ukrainians are not wholly heroic by nature. We tried appeasement before with Peter the Great. We tried it later with Putin ceding Crimea and parts of the Donbas to Imperial Russia in 2014 and 2015, hoping that compromise might bring peace. As we all know by now, it only invited further aggression. The lesson carved in blood and loss is this: when facing an empire that views your very existence as negotiable, survival itself becomes an act of resistance that cannot be halfway. Living under existential threat. What existential threat exactly means as lived experience? You have not asked, but I will tell you anyway. It is being grateful every morning simply to wake up together and discover that your friends and loved ones are still alive and almost unharmed, to approach each ordinary day as if it were your birthday. This is when only a thin line of defenders with Ukrainian insignia stands between you and occupation, between you and violence. It's when every day, say 400 of them, will be wounded, killed, or vanish without a trace. This is when your teenage daughter's joy over a cooling bag for transporting donor blood, bought with pooled money to help medics on the front lines, exceeds any happiness you felt at her age receiving your first designer handbag. The evolution from outrage to endurance. In the first weeks of the Great War, it was a matter of courage, defiance, anarchic resistance. But in the fourth year of this war of attrition, it has become a question of patience and even willingness to suffer. Because it's better to suffer as equals among beloved strangers than to fall prey to an enemy who hates your very identity and the fact that you exist. Beloved strangers, that beautiful paradox of kinship with unknown compatriots to whom you owe so much. Participatory work is key under given circumstances. Meaningful engagement is essential. It kindles hope and fosters connection. When people lose their power to act, they first retreat into self-absorption, then they slide into bondage. Turning suffering into a show, a spectacle of pain, is the worst. There is a spectrum of immersion in war. Only some of us have experienced war and trench as trench on our own skin. A much larger portion are those who have simply been working without days off for the fourth year now, going to sleep and waking up under air bombardments, having to cope with psychological and physical destruction, mourn the dead, withstand the cold and electricity outages, and support the living with all their strengths, run this marathon without stopping and rush to help others. Because when you're working through hell, they say, it's better not to stop and keep going. By 2022, Ukrainians had proven adept at social imagination, collaborative action, and civic engagement, building on accumulated knowledge and experience. We had come to grasp the full genocidal intent behind Russia's war, a calculated revenge against our independence of thought and social solidarity, against our realized decentralization and inclusive commitment to the common good, against our insistence on human dignity above all else. This was punishment for reviving the anti-Soviet struggle for rights, led by almost forgotten dissidents of the 60s and 70s, for making the value of human existence tangible and real, and for doing this even when the Ukrainian economy was not growing but declining, or rising more slowly than wages and living standards in the neighboring tyranny. Ukrainians now understand, as few others can, that everything material vanishes in an instant, in the flash of a single strike. For the 5th generation in a row, we are a culture without family heirlooms. But dignity remains our unbreakable core, the one thing that cannot be stolen from us or our children. In this chaos, our words in poetry must cut through the endless stream of social media images that flicker and fade in the white noise of information overload. They must endure where everything else dissolves. Another dimension of this great war in Europe is Russian contempt for international law that has neither been brought to the dock nor met with immediate, forceful retaliation. The security architecture has proven almost worthless. As of mid-August 2025, whoever is stronger and more brazen is in the right. Ukrainian singularity is not so singular after all, and the privilege of remaining bomb-free could suddenly and accidentally end across our entire continent. This threat is taken seriously in the Baltic states. Witness literature and narrative justice. War breaks language and normalcy. Simply witnessing deliberately inflicted, repeated suffering, seeing it with one's own eye while acutely aware of one's helplessness and vulnerability, can drive a person to moral paralysis. And this is where witness literature, that tension between the compulsion to speak and the paralysis of helplessness. The witness then is redefined as subject, not object. The one who can speak, has credentials to speak, and feels an obligation to speak in testimony. Elie Wiesel, in his Noble Acceptance speech, positioned witness literature as literature's most significant innovation since the advent of modernism. Each era has contributed its forms: tragedy from the Greeks, epistles from the Romans, sonnets from the Renaissance, but our last 100 years have answered catastrophe with testimony. The specific literary form matters. It matters less than the fundamental shift. A new mimesis grounded in credibility, forging unprecedented trust between writer and reader through shared commitment to truth. Crucially, this literature often emerges from those previously excluded from literary canons: survivors, marginalized voices, those without traditional literary training, making it inherently aligned with decolonial efforts. It introduces the notion of narrative justice. Oftentimes, witness effort is situated in the fast-changing, risky, unsettling present. By privileging lived experience over formal education and centering voices that dominant cultures have systematically silenced, witness literature dismantles the hierarchies that have long determined whose stories matter and who gets to tell them. This democratization of literary authority transforms not just what contemporary literature can be, but who can create it, fundamentally challenging the gatekeeping mechanism of traditional literary establishments. Testimony presupposes a guarantor of what will be spoken. One always testifies before someone, and in this literary genre there is a demand for the authenticity of lived experience. This touches on what narratologists call the testimonial pact, a unique form of the autobiographical pact that Philippe Lejeune theorized, but with higher stakes. In testimony, the writer doesn't just promise to tell their truth. They position themselves as a witness narrator whose authority derives from presence and survival. As Shoshana Feldman and Dori Laub argued in Testimony: Crisis of Witnessing, this creates a triangulated relationship: the witness, the addressee, who becomes a co-witness, and the event itself. It is distinct from fictional or even autobiographical authority because it carries an ethical burden. Contemporary trauma theory, Kathy Caruso, Dominique Lacapra, Giorgio Agamben, emphasizes how testimony must represent the unrepresentable, creating what Agamben terms a lacuna, the gap where language fails but must continue. In my Ukrainian context, this takes on additional urgency. The testimonial genre becomes what Gayatri Spivak might call a form of strategic essentialism, claiming the authority of experience precisely because that experience has been systematically erased or denied. The guarantor I mention isn't just individual credibility, but collective survival. Each testimony validates others in a network of corroboration against deliberate disinformation. Witness literature emerges from the unbearable. We rarely invoke this genre for nostalgic memoirs or documentary chronicles of peaceful times. The testimonial imperative arises precisely when harm exceeds ordinary narrative frameworks and demands a different kind of truth-telling. We turn to witness literature not to record life as it was lived, but to preserve what should never have happened and must never happen again. The sacred and sacrilegious, Russia's militarized civic religion. The Russo-Ukraine war has been often read out from geopolitical point of view. Ukrainians versus Russians, anti-Soviets versus pro-Soviets, pro-West versus anti-West. There was less argument on the religious and cultural dimension of the war. USSR was an atheistic state from its inception that repressed and killed much of the clergy, plundered and then destructed or repurposed majority of churches, synagogues and mosques across the country by mid-1930s. Soviet policy aimed at eliminating religious practices in themselves. Executing this politics, it was vicious and blasphemous. When the sacrilegious offense is verbal, it is called blasphemy. And when physical, it is often called desecration or just sacrilege. Blasphemy is word-based or image-based. Sacrilege is blasphemy at work. There is understanding that blasphemy, with its verbal, visual and written assaults upon the sacred and identity, has reappeared to become a fixture upon the West's cultural horizon, as David Nash put it. There is less awareness that it has become a fixture of Eastern Europe's horizon as well. Then there is still less understanding that blasphemy operates as akin to post-truth. Blasphemy pushes the limits of thinkable and sayable. When directed against the spirit, it renders in scriptures as unforgivable. It is decoded as conscious and cynical resistance to truth. Resistance to truth and denying it make humility and repentance impossible, while this inability to repent blocks the very possibility of forgiveness. Russia as a state and a church never shared responsibility and, what is more, never atoned for the past tragedies of the 20th century. On the contrary, it usurped and repackaged the memory of the great victory of the Nazis under the slogan, "We can repeat it, можем повторить." But what state propaganda implied was bringing back civilian tragedy and turning it into routine, inflicting terror after terror, smashing schools, hospitals and residential areas while mocking the feebleness of international laws, values and security frameworks. I'd like to argue that what has happened with the Russian mainstream orthodoxy after 1991, or mostly after the turn of the millennium and Putin's rise to power, amounts to malign reformulation of the sacred, exploitation of the mythical image of the Holy Rus, and then to the top-down sacrilege. The most influential study of the power of the Holy Rus metaphor in the last decades remained the book Saint Russie by French historian Alain Besançon. He gave an adequate attention to the nexus of Russian Orthodoxy and Russian politics in the longue durée, the Kremlin's spiritual goals, not only its religious propaganda. Most importantly, in his view, this represents the blending of religious and national themes under the strict surveillance of a particularly despotic autocracy. No other country except the Holy Land has dared to call itself holy, yet the Holy Rus utterance simultaneously surrounds the land, people, and state with a halo of sanctity. Year after year, the Moscow Patriarchy was bolstering political image of Putin as main defender of orthodoxy in the world. Patriarch Kirill was the one to excavate an ancient expression, the Holy Rus, and to modify it for the purposes of the 21st century, known under the name of Ruski Mir, Russian world. He insisted that no ethnic differences and no political borders could shatter the alleged spiritual unity between Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. This ideological twist has been detected by dissident Father Yakov Krotov as imperial militarism of the Moscow Patriarchy. This militant religious Russian nationalism was one of the key elements of Putin's motivation for the invasion of Ukraine. When a church-led society acknowledges its own evilness without shame and even with pride, that's when it crosses the line and slides into sacrilege. During Vladimir Putin's 2.5 decades in charge of Russia, the Soviet victory in the Great Patriotic War, as the World War II is still called there, has become the main building block of a new Russian civic religion. Since 2020, the war victory has its own religious shrine in Kubinka, near Moscow, and when we look back from the year 2025 at the Putin era, this cathedral seems its most essential creation. The cathedral was the project of Russia's then defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, and the opening was scheduled to mark the 75th anniversary of victory over the Nazis. Due to pandemic, the ceremony was delayed and repurposed. Shoigu, Putin, and the Patriarch Kirill of Moscow attended the service on June 22, the anniversary of the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union in 1941. Patriarch Kirill, who has called Putin's rule a miracle of God, said the new cathedral holds the hope that future generations will take up the spiritual inheritance from those before them and safeguard the fatherland from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Russia's Cathedral of the Armed Forces, this is how it is called, you can Google it up, is not an Orthodox church, but a shrine to post-Soviet civil religion, featuring Soviet symbols in stained glass, military mosaics depicting battles, and floors made from melted Wehrmacht weapons. The controversial imagery blends militarism with Christianity. Angels hover about artillery. The Virgin Mary poses like a Soviet war poster, Rodina Mать. And mosaics commemorate conflict, including forcing peace on Georgia and the return of Crimea. Originally featuring images of Putin and Stalin that were later removed after public outcry, the cathedral deliberately leaves space for future military conquests to be added to its walls, a deeply eschatological vision of endless war as a sacred destiny. The cathedral's panels also commemorate Russia's wars in Chechnya and Soviet military interventions that crushed the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, the Prague Spring in 1968, and the invasion of Afghanistan, sanctifying these acts of aggression as sacred missions. While Russia has numerous war museums, this cathedral represents something entirely unprecedented. It makes explicit the quasi-religious framework through which war is remembered, glorified, and perpetually reenacted in Russian culture. It also makes bluntly clear the nexus between those who perpetrated violence and those who perpetuate it. Breaking with history, Ukraine's counter-narrative. To break with dark history, it is essential to be capable to imagine the history other way, or just to imagine another future possible. Participation in culture has intensified and got deeper across Ukraine since 2014. The same could be said about participation in history. Institutions and societies, Ukrainians remind to the rest of the world not only preserve themselves, but never stop changing. Not to be blinded by the ready-made narratives is a responsibility of a decent free thinking. The process of disintegration of the Warsaw Bloc and then the USSR fell into the era of postmodernism. Postmodernism was closely related to postcolonialism, and in the Soviet context it entered a culture heavily mutilated by socialist realism. Consequently, the marginal became central not only in novels and films, but it also found itself in the focus of political and economical news, as well as in the focus of historical news, called the closing of white spots, white gaps, the disclosure of unknown facts previously kept in the secret files and forbidden to the public. When the former colonies began to fight for their dignity, equality, and independence, they spoke up. Their history and their truths were different from what was taught in the imperial capital. Against these backgrounds, a new epistemological framework of pluralism and the coexistence of an infinite number of points of view and many micro-truths emerges. However, some stories from below, or stories from the periphery, turned out to be cognitively and morally incompatible with the official narrative of a post-empire. Its self-description crumbled from the collision with the description made by the other. Therefore, postmodernism gave a place for the other, a platform, a screen, and a microphone, but did not give it a political power and moral weight, so that what was seen and experienced in a different way changed the consciousness of people raised by the empire already after the empire. The power of alternative histories was provided not only to work with collective memory. It was supposed to train the collective political imagination and prepare a different vision of an inclusive world and a different future. However, this vision has been obscured, and the future itself was blocked by the declaration of the end of history. The decentralization, eccentricity, and polyphony of postmodernism opened the sources for the emergence of some other common narrative, valid both in the former center and the recent periphery, a narrative that is both more comprehensive and closer to the truth. The demand for truth returned, and the episteme changed once more. The emancipatory potential of pluralism was exhausted, because it led to irresponsibility, civic passivity, and criminal inaction. Now, this was not a let all flowers bloom or every version is right and wrong at the same time instruction. After many decades of silencing and then fragmentation, dispersal of microhistories, there was an urgent need for new synthesis, a new truth, and even a new centralism, but on other principles. There was the famous dispute between Kant and Lessing. Lessing argued that a lie which heals is always better than a truth which wounds. Kant maintained that while truth may sometimes hurt and lies may sometimes cure, one must always hold to the truth. Why? Because if we permit one great lie, then all agreements and declarations become suspect and lose their force, and communication between people becomes absurdly impossible. But his crowning argument was not pragmatic, but ethical. Through lies, we demean the dignity of another person, because we turn them into a means of achieving our own ends, however noble or our intentions must be. To understand the scale of distortions and threatening manipulations of collective imagination and memory in Russia prior and after the collapse of the USSR, it is necessary to look at the state of post-Soviet nostalgia through the optics of memory ethics. To see the inability of nostalgic people to distance themselves from the catastrophic past and place moral accents in it. This system was cruel and crooked. In Soviet cinema and literature, there were rare but still important attempts to circumvent or overcome censorship. Part of the cultural production worked with large audiences of viewers and readers acting within the system but using hints, the skills of reading between the lines, due to secret biographical knowledge and the similarity of fate and experience. So actually, Soviet anti-Soviet literature existed, Soviet anti-Soviet film existed, and people were capable to decipher that. Since the declaration of the Russian Federation as the legal successor of the USSR, glasnost has never been officially contested. But the works with the memory of, and especially with the guilt for, the Soviet systemic terror at the official level gradually collapsed. The grief and trauma of the victims and their descendants of the state violence inflicted by the USSR on its own citizens were not recognized and at least somehow compensated by the state, but were reduced to the circle of inconspicuous local groups of activists. Government programs for a detailed study of the mechanics of mass repressions and artificial famine or legal prosecutions of the perpetrators of these historical crimes, if they were at the stage of development, did not gain any strength. The formula that Stalinism, with its millions of victims among the enemies of the people, in vertical commas, as well as their women and children, and later Brezhnev's persecution of dissidents and their families randomly affected all the peoples of the USSR, including the Russians, was presented as an insoluble ethical aporia. Once everyone suffered, then there is no one to blame and no one to call to justice. Determining the growth of Soviet nostalgia in Russia as a trend that deepened and grew in all generations, even the long-time opponents of the Soviet system, Mikhail Gefter, said in one of his later interviews that the Soviet in general is something that has been lost and misplaced. None of the many researchers or commentators of this phenomenon dared to pose the question, is it moral to be nostalgic for the Soviet Union? Or sharpen it to its core? Is it conceivable to be nostalgic for the Gulag? These two questions are far from rhetorical. They undermine the picture of the world and the identity of the post-Soviet person. After all, based on this formulation of the question, 35 years after the collapse of the USSR, the Soviet past is no longer and cannot be the post-Soviet present. Its memory faded, and then it was retrospectively condemned in the Baltic countries, in Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia, in Kazakhstan, but not in the Russian Federation itself, which just happened to be the successor of the USSR. The common Soviet, общесоветское, ceased to be common. And now we know that not only nostalgia, but also solidarity in the lies about the Soviet legacy between the political elites, the mass media, and the educated class has happened to Russians over these decades. Zeitgeisty, post-Soviet men and women in Russia exchanged one nihilism for another. The post-World War II emigration to the West during the Cold War transformed Russian and East Slavic studies, attracting top intellectuals to understand the Soviet Union across the Iron Curtain. By 1991, the 12 EU member states had produced thousands of specialists in the field, but these experts faced declining job opportunities as Russia-related research lost government funding and market demand after the Soviet collapse. However, this training created significant knowledge deficits and blind spots in their supposed expertise. Language instruction remained Russian only. Cross-disciplinary expertise stayed stubbornly Moscow-centric, and substantial teaching continued in what Zeev Jabotinsky, a famous Odessan, called Pushkin face, avoiding uncomfortable questions to preserve idealized narratives. In retrospect, given Russia's barbaric war on Ukraine, such professional behavior constitutes intellectual dishonesty. As all the Sovietologist ranks thinned, few bright new East European experts emerged, perhaps because the attitudes, topics, and programs on offer had become obsolete. These outdated programs and research institutes sometimes received helpful funding from Ruski Mir, introduced in 2001 with Russian Orthodox and Slavophile tendencies, and oligarchic sources, allowing them to freeze in time rather than adapt to regional realities. Meanwhile, Ukraine was developing at astronomical speed, not economically, but in terms of its grassroots society, exemplifying healthy democracy. This Russocentrism contributed to Ukraine's epistemic erasure as a unique socio-political and vibrant cultural space. This epistemic erasure must be understood in connection to the current material erasure through air bombs, missiles, and drone attacks. Even prestigious programs with long-term reputations promoted imperial messages explaining newly independent states as belated nations with incomplete cultures destined to remain in Russia's sphere of domination. Notably, the concept of Eurasian studies, institutionalized in the West over the last 20 years, was invented and disseminated by Putin's notorious Valdai Discussion Club as part of his plan to create a Eurasian Union opposing the European Union. We, Ukrainians, have paid for this loud-mouthed ignorance with human lives, smashed livelihoods and ruined communities. The books most helpful in detecting Putin's assault on civil society and looming war came from field studies of contemporary Russia and Ukraine, but not from Russian studies. Just as the birth of deconstruction took place adjacent to the construction of the Berlin Wall, although few recognized this at the time, it appears that a new optics and ethos of the humanities are now emerging. The European West, since 1989, has been a utopian place with no enemy. It feared the Soviet Union for so long, and for a reason, that it opted for immediate amnesia after the Berlin Wall collapsed and the Soviet army left Central Europe, removing its nuclear peril. The Soviet Union peaceful dissolution made it in a post-war, post-Soviet, but above all, post-Cold War era. Ukraine's nuclear disarmament was a happy hiatus. Nobody in the West was afraid anymore, and almost nobody was paying attention to what comes after. But in Russia's eye, the enemy was there, and the devil was still coming from the West. The grammar of survival, between fracture and community. There are experiences and gestures that a writer's imagination could never invent. Do you know why modern Ukrainians in big cities, when going to bed, put dog food in one pocket of their pajamas and flower seeds in the other? The first, so that search and rescue dogs can sniff them out faster if they are still alive, but unconscious under the rubble. The quicker they can locate a person in distress, the better the chances of clearing the ruins in time to save someone. The second, in case they don't manage to survive. Then a person wants to leave at least some trace at the site of their murder in this unpunished terror. Let their favorite flowers sprout and bloom there. Do you know why migrating storks fight among themselves when returning to their Ukrainian villages in the war zone in the spring? No, not because people fight on the front lines and set a bad example for the birds to follow, but because part of last year's houses were destroyed along with their nests, and there are not enough nesting spots for everyone. New ones must be created. And storks do indeed weave new nests in the old places, inventively using new makeshift materials of war. For example, fiber optics cables that hang everywhere like giant spider webs endlessly woven by flying drone spiders. Actually, storks have been flying here every March for millennia as totemic animals that people love and protect, and whom they watch with longing as they fly away in formations to North Africa 6 months later, having raised their chicks from small eggs into large and strong birds. So yes, storks return even during war, for the 11th year now. You will discover exactly how well you are protected when you test your protection. In recent years, storks have seen how non-flying humans abandon their half-destroyed nests and become defenseless, displaced persons. Good and evil, for me, involve particular names and circumstances, my own included. Ethics emerges where autobiography meets history, shaped by the storyteller's own nature. When Hamlet's reference to be or not to be is no longer your choice but lies in the aggressor's hands, the vulnerability of helplessness becomes a devastating trap. Rather than succumb to this paralysis, Ukrainians often chose a paradoxical strategy: to remain fragile, yet forge an unbreakable resilience. And where is the role of the writer and literature in this? It lies in the great and the small. It seems to me that for a writer from a country that has been defending itself from an aggressor for years now, in a war of attrition and survival, there are several tasks. How do we tell the story of contemporary Ukraine so that it penetrates Europe's minds and souls hundreds and thousands of miles away? How do we distill unarticulated feelings? How do we translate daily nightmares? Or the vibrant life which goes on? How doesn't everybody live in bunkers and underground? War is the setting of the story, but it is not the whole story. How people live, love, cope, and produce kindness and care for each other, this is the story. There is also another level of task, even more demanding: the focus on massive crime, anger, and seeking narrative justice. Writers should write about how to bring about at least some justice, how to restore and rehabilitate the victim's dignity, body and soul, and how to move forward. We lose friends and loved ones almost daily, in their beds or in daily chorus strolling through their cities. There is no secure place anywhere in Ukraine for the 4th year. We are in the debilitating non-stop process of mourning. Is joy stolen forever? And lest we forget that the Ukrainian army, effectively deterring Russian aggression along the 100-kilometer-long front line, is people's army. It is comprised of ordinary citizens of all walks of life and of all ages like you and me. And many of my fellow writers told themselves on the bad morning of February 22, I will write more poetry and prose, but I'm fighting this war first. This full-scale war has already claimed over 250 souls from our cultural world. Artists, thinkers, writers, critics, translators, each loss is irreplaceable. David Chichkan, 39, carried 4 generations of artistic legacy in his blood. Son of cave artist, grandson of an artist, great-grandson of a revolutionary painter in Ukraine's 1920s avant-garde. He chose the battlefield over the studio and gave his life for our defense on August 10. So this is also a story of the people having to choose between creating and defending the very culture they help building. And the enemy fears not only our brains and weapons, but also our simple humanity. It destroys points of warmth, rescue, mutual aid. That's why, besides housing, so many hospitals and medical stations have been destroyed, schools and universities, humanitarian volunteer centers, libraries and resilience centers, all those third places where people can gather and serve as support for one another. But Ukraine is strong in horizontal connections, and thanks to European backing, we do not stop going through hell. Every life is priceless, every feat is priceless, and we maintain the courage to save. We have real heroes now. We don't need to invent them or pretend. Their deeds are real and life-saving for us and for you. My grandfather told me when I was still little that intelligence, decency, and great trials should not be written on a person's forehead, but your effort paves the way. The key difference between what happens to Ukrainians under Russian occupation and what happens to them when they are free but randomly die under daily air attacks, under cruise missiles, under bombs and shaheds from Russia is this. Here, everyone must realize their own mortality and say goodnight each time as if it were the last, without excessive pathos, but in a way that shows all their care and love. There, in the occupied territories, everyone must realize their own humiliation and lacking protection of the law. You will be raped, tortured, separated from your family, stripped of agency, home and property, and only then will you die. The choice is clear. Either it is free Ukraine, all of it, or this is another concentration camp and genocide in the middle of Europe. Protect the protectors. That's the lesson here. This slogan must become the defining political and cultural imperative of our century, because this is not simply Russia's war against Ukraine. This is war against all rules, an avalanche of horrific war crimes. When deterrence and penalty fail, survival itself dictates the terms. Protect the protectors. Destroy the destroyers. Join the sovereignty of European states to regain strength and relevance. Let us remember, the strength to endure in inhuman conditions is not limitless. And it's better for European community to move even faster, because this cannot be, as Ukrainian poet said. In all the hotspots of the planet, we must protect life saturated with love and unity, the lifestyle and nurturing, local rootedness in communities, non-orphanhood. More than once it has happened that within our Ukrainian pen trips to unbreakable libraries in frontline zones with new books, necessary humanitarian aid, and literary meeting readings, we asked ourselves, who charges whom? So much light, hope, human warmth, food, stories, and quiet care we received from those who are truly exhausted and tired from the war and its ever-growing threats and losses. Our friends from the Kharkiv Literary Museum called their new exhibition and performance around it In the Name of the City. Let me remind you that under pressure from Russian forces, 2 million Kharkiv emptied by 2/3, to maybe just 800,000 now, but held on. Neighbors became like family to each other, and now people are returning, youth is returning, and the city lives its resurrection and transformation. The exhibition is about Dear Kharkiv as a city in a bulletproof West, a city under the protection and care of its own residents. It is hieroglyphically simple, like a visual 3D telegram to the future, carved by skilled hands from a piece of wood. Here is an apartment building. Here is another and another. Here is a map of the city between two rivers, like the Tigris and Euphrates, and their Mesopotamia, because Kharkiv is really between the two rivers. Here are death masks, many deaths. Here are flowers in a tree, a person and a book and a bird. And the black hole will not swallow them, never, because they have already become symbols. And here is the rough, thick thread that binds everything firmly together. And if one of them falls, the others will fall too. And if after falling they need to straighten up, they all have to do it in turn, carefully, in one rope team, like mountain climbers. And victory, paramoha, will also be one for all, though many will not live to see it. I know that I sound here unshamedly sentimental, but this is how it feels in medias res. My country now is like a teenager whom you can ask, who do you want to be? Because it's growing and developing so rapidly, and it definitely won't be the same as before this war. What my foreign colleagues from various countries sometimes envy me for is our wonderful youth, our students, already so mature, wise, responsible, seasoned idealists among the experienced. Let me tell you a story from Savinci, a large village whose community was under occupation for 6 months in 2022. Many material losses, many fellow villagers killed, essentially every 20th person. There were also stories of collaboration and denunciations. But who has now become the core of the community? Who strategizes, as they say, a community without outskirts, where no one is left unaccounted for and not at the center of attention? That same wonderful youth. They have 110 projects, ideas for how to arrange their new better life, and more than 20 are being implemented right now, not after, but during the war. I don't know whether the City Hall of Lviv has 110 projects for the next couple of years. We need a world in which global institutions endorse these new sensitivities, think and act in the right magnitude and at the high speed, where we stretch our imagination against parochial thinking. Another era of democratic Europe will begin. And to my question, whether they understood that following Savinci's example, their generation would gradually have to rebuild almost all of Ukraine as part of New Europe, and it will take decades of work. The answer was simply yes. And that's wonderful, because we want to rebuild it brick by brick as everything was, but with love and consideration, with respect for what came before, we'll rebuild our country as we want it, as we need it for the future. I couldn't help but grin happily, to borrow from my fellow Vivian Stanislav Jogilė, black humorist, witness, survivor. Let's not expect too much of the end of the world. Now let me close as poets do with a poem. I have an epigraph from Ukrainian dissident of 60 years, Ivan Svetlichny, and the line goes like this: and in the heart unsubdued by evil. A letter to speak out, not to say something. A non-creation of non-art, collective, not mine. Many, many days spent in energy-saving mode. Our advantage was once considered vitalism, life affirmation. There was so much passion around, such vibrant colors. And now, like in a hospice, nothing is unfading. Every day they come for someone. Sensors have atrophied. It's hard to feel anything except anger or rage. It's hard to understand what's unclear here. If cows could write, they would also write about care and guardianship, about how important it is to be milked carefully and on time. Caregivers live like people of war in secular time, where there is no end in sight. No novelty indeed. We've seen it all before. We've gotten used to everything, layer by layer. No progress. Everything is exactly as it was for our grandmothers, again and again, without vacation or rest, without normal sleep, without a comprehensible goal. Every person needs someone caring, loving, especially at the beginning and at the end. Attention is such a rare and generous gift. Daily care without exaltation, without elevation. Hello, we survived the night. We lived to see the morning. Feed with warmth, wash with fragrance, wipe dry. Listen to the same funny story for the 500th time and smile wearily to understand that you can no longer handle this, but handle it somehow. Take into account the given conditions, not the ideal ones, as in a school problem. Care and nursing are blood, piss, shit, and a bowl of vomit. Even under bombs, especially under bombs, the crucial question remains the same. How much of someone's pain and decline are we able to alleviate? This is part of the cause and effect human connection. Like a heat-seeking missile launched from man-pads, a letter belongs more to the addressee than to the author.
Thank you. We have a half an hour, a bit more, for questions and answers. Mes turim apie pusvalandį, šiek tiek daugiau, kiek? 20? Apie pusvalandį klausimams. Labai kviečiu pagalvoti ir drąsiai užduoti klausimus. Aš galiu gal pradėti apšildyti klausimų atsakymų sesiją. I really liked the concepts that you are using or introducing as narrative justice and how it's connected to witness literature. And you talk about it through the whole presentation. My question is, who is the most important audience for this kind of witness literature? You talk about cultural memory, which I understand is important for community itself, right? But you also talk about claim to justice. And I really wonder, who do you really want to read that witness literature? Who is the most important audience to listen to that? And I will translate that to Lithuanian. Man labai patiko naudojamos savokos kaip naratyvinis teisingumas, liudijimų literatūra. Ir mano pagrindinis klausimas, nuo kurio aš pradedu, yra, kam šitie liudijimai yra skirti pirmiausia ir kas yra pagrindinė arba svarbiausia auditorija. Nes viena vertus tai yra kultūrinės atminties dalis, tai reiškia yra skirta pačiai bendruomeniai. Kita vertus, pranešime daug kalbama apie teisingumą ir teisingumo atstatymą. Ir mano klausimas yra, kas yra svarbiausia auditorija, kas turėtų išgirsti tą liudijimo literatūrą.
Well, this is a tricky one. As a literary scholar, I have been working with the topic of negative heritage for more than a decade.
Suktas, sudėtingas klausimas. Aš kaip literatūros mokslininkė daugiau negu 10 metų dirbau su neigiamu paveldu.
And I am a native of a city which has a lot of repercussion in the 20th century history, a city with at least triple identity, part of which was absolutely lost.
Aš esu taip pat iš miesto, kuris turėjo daugybę sukrėtimų, turi trigubą tapatybę, kurių viena yra apskritai prarasta.
I remember a young diasporic scholar coming from Canada in the early 90s when Soviet Union still was existing, but in cities like Lviv, in the border areas of the Soviet Union, the air was fresher and the change was in the air.
Aš dirbau su kanadiečiu mokslininku, kuris atvyko į regioną, kuriame 90-aisiais po Sovietų Sąjungos griuvimo, kur oras buvo gaivesnis.
And he said something which was not meant as an offense, but offended me heavily.
Ir jis pasakė šitą, kas neturėjo būti įžeidimas, bet tai, kas mane smarkiai įžeidė.
The city is beautiful. People here do not belong here.
Miestas yra gražus, bet žmonės jam nepriklauso.
And I have been trained, I thought, in a good school, in a good university. I was 25 years old, but when people approached me fast with questions, where is this, where is that, how do you know, or how can we navigate here in the place of history of Polish community or Jewish community, I was absolutely unprepared. It was a discovery. I was from another planet. I really didn't belong here. Then I understood.
Aš ilgą laiką dirbau, gavau išsilavinimą universitete, bet kai man užduodavo klausimą apie paties miesto istoriją ir vietas, tai kur yra lenkiškos bendruomenės vietos, kur yra žydiškos bendruomenės vietos, aš negalėdavau atsakyti šitą klausimą, aš supratau, kad taip ir nepriklausau šitam miestui.
My city has started anew at around 1944-45 because 90% of its physical heritage of the hard war survived through the World War II, but 90% of its social texture of the community has been destroyed.
Miestas pradėjo naują gyvenimą po 44-45 metų, nors 90% miesto pastatų buvo išsaugota, išliko, išgyveno karą, bet 90% socialinio audinio žmonių nebeliko.
Yeah. And sometimes people think, well, the Jewish community was perished in the Holocaust. The Polish community was deported by Stalin because of the redrawing of the borders, but Ukrainian remains. No, it's not true. Ukrainian urbanites in Lviv also were either destructed by Stalin or fled to the west.
Manoma, kad žydų bendruomenė neišgyveno holokausto, lenkų bendruomenė Stalino buvo ištremti, o ukrainiečių bendruomenė liko. Bet tai nėra tiesa. Ukrainiečių intelektualinis elitas, jisai taip pat buvo arba Stalino represuotas, arba išvyko į vakarus.
So the transition of memory, transition of political culture and historical culture and even family stories was absolutely interrupted and repressed.
Tradicijos, kultūros ir šeimų istorijų perdavimas buvo nutrauktas ir represuojamas.
And when I started to work with all kind of autobiographical accounts of Jews and Poles who were Lvivians, and they were meant to be Lvivians, unlike me, for example, I was puzzled by a fact that some of these stories, especially after 1960s, after 1970s, in the second generation, sometimes in the third generation, these stories were written not in Yiddish, not in Hebrew, not in Polish, but for example in English or in German or in other languages. Some were even written in Ukrainian.
Kai aš pradėjau dirbti su autobiografiniais pasakojimais, Lenkų bendruomenės, žydų bendruomenės, kurie buvo Lvivo gyventojai, ypač pasakojimai, kurie kurti 60-aisiais, 70-aisiais, tai galėjo būti jau antra, trečia karta, jie nerašė hebrajiškai, jie nerašė jidiš, jie nerašė lenkiškai, bet veikiau angliškai ir vokiškai. German, right?
German, and even some of them wanted to be translated into Ukrainian or were written in Ukrainian.
Kai kurie net buvo parašyti arba norėjo, kad jų pasakojimai būtų išversti į ukrainiečių kalbą.
And then I understood that clearly these stories are for me and for my students, for example. These are for contemporary Lvivians.
Ir tuomet aš supratau, kad šitos istorijos yra pirmiausia man ir mano studentams, tai reiškia šiuolaikiniams Lvivo gyventojams.
Yes, so I think the witness literature always is in a way directed into the future. And we cannot know who exactly is our auditorium, who exactly will be listening or reading them. But I know that the time will come when the story of this war will be blurred, forgotten, not important for decades, and then it will be rediscovered. And the human accounts, the literary accounts will be really important because nobody will be excavating the social media of the time.
Ir tai man padėjo suprasti, kad šitie liudijimai pirmiausia rašomi į ateitį, kad istorija nebūtų pamiršta, kad praėjus veikiausiai nemažai laiko po karo ši istorija būtų išsaugota ir kad būtent žmonių pasakojimai būtų išlaikyti.
But on the quite other level, I would say that writing now has a therapeutical effect on the authors as well. And we share these stories on the social media platform like Facebook or some threads or blue skies or anything. And I know that people value being able to look into others' stories as into the mirror, recognizing a lot of their own experience, which is often under-articulated or not articulated, and then saying, okay, now I know what I'm going through, and I know how to preserve my humanity, because one of the targets of this war is to dehumanize the enemy.
Dabar šitie liudijimai atlieka terapeutinę funkciją. Žmonės yra linkę dalinti šitais pasakojimais, atsiminimais socialinėse medijose, jų yra labai daug ir kitiems tai yra labai svarbu skaityti, atpažinti kaip tam tikrą patvirtinimą savo patirčių. What was the second part of what you were saying?
I don't know what was
Okay, let's make it shorter.
Maybe somebody can help what was not translated.
Dehumanization.
I was talking that one of the aims... One of the aims of this war on the Russian side is to dehumanize Ukrainians and to dehumanize the image of Ukrainians. And I think one of our major tasks is not to slide into this and to remain human.
Vienas iš šito karo tikslų arba siekinių yra žmonių dehumanizavimas ir todėl mums labai svarbu ten nepatekti, ten nenuslysti ir išlaikyti šitą žmogišką veidą. Gal yra norinčių užduoti klausimą? Kviečiu, nesidrovėkit. I will proceed with my second question. Ir labai kviečiu visus pagalvoti ir prisidėti prie šitos diskusijos. I will proceed with the second question. Since I work myself in academia, I constantly struggle with the whole infrastructure of Slavic institutes, and which are called Slavic institutes. Usually they are Russian studies across the West, let's put it this way. There are many of them in US and in Europe as well. When I was surprised when I understood how much it's like Russia-centered and Russian-dominated. Then I've heard from Sovietologists, historians, cultural historians as well, saying that the way they are trained, that in order to say anything about the past, they have to go to the center, which is Moscow, to work with Russian archives, with archives in Moscow. And then they assume everything about the Soviet Union. That has started changing because many of them cannot get access to the archives anymore. So my impression is that many scholars are looking for another center. So now Ukraine will be another center. Do you think that's a good solution for the, attempt to de-center Russia from the whole 20th century history? Mano klausimas yra toks, kadangi aš pati dirbu universitete ir susiduriu su, dažnai tai vadinasi slavistikos studijos arba slavistikos centrai vakaruose, bet dažniausiai jie yra labai rusocentriški. Mane tai šiek tiek nustebino. Mano klausimas buvo, klausimas sovietologams, kaip čia taip nutinka, kodėl viskas yra tik tai iš centro žvilgsnio. Jų pasakojimas yra toks, kad taip kaip jie yra mokomi, kaip istorikai, jie turi važiuoti, norėdami ką nors pasakyti apie Sovietų sąjungą, jie turi važiuoti į Maskvą, dirbti Maskvos archyvose ir tada jie, daro apibendrinimus, kad tai buvo Sovietų sąjungoje. Dabar daug tų centrų susiduria su problema, kad nebegali patekti į archyvus. Tai mano jausmas, pojūtis yra toks, kad yra ieškoma naujo centro. Tai dabar Ukraina tampa naujas centras, dabar važiuojama į Ukrainos archyvus. Bet and that's also because I come more from social sciences and anthropology. I'm really surprised with this center-specific approach. Kadangi aš ateinu iš socialinių mokslų ir man aktualios atrodo antropologijos studijos, mane labai nustebino šitas toks į centrą orientuotas žvilgsnis. Ir aš klausiu Irynos, ar dabar vis ne Maskvos, o Ukrainos studijos yra geras sprendimas, jeigu mes galvojam, kad norime to 20 amžiaus istorijoje išcentruoti Rusiją.
My attitude here will be rude. First of all, I want to mention that nobody dared, even in 1960s, to call Germany post-Nazi country.
Mano atsakymas bus grubus. Niekas net 60-aisiais nedrįso Vokietijos vadinti po-nacistinę Vokietiją.
The legacy was there. A lot of people were still alive, which were entangled in the previous epoch of the Nazi time, but it was called something new and it was future-oriented.
Palikimas buvo, daugybė žmonių, kurie taip pat dirbo praėjusiame režime, dar buvo gyvi, bet niekas nedrįso vadinti po nacistinę Vokietiją, tai buvo kažkoks nauja valstybė.
It's also important to mention that Germany is harmfully divided into two parts, and the western part of Germany is doing its intellectual work about the negative heritage and legacy of this heritage since mid-1960s, and the question what our fathers did is lingering.
Tai reikia suprasti dar ir kad Vokietija buvo padalinta ir vakarų Vokietija dirbo su tuo klausimu, kuo užsiėmė mūsų tėvai praėjusiame režime nuo kokių 60-ųjų.
There is no such public discussion in the Eastern Germany, in the Soviet-dominated Germany, first of all, because there is no democracy, there is no agora, there is no public space, and uncensored discussion which can go on.
Bet Rytų Vokietijoje buvo priešingai ir tokios diskusijos nevyko, nes nebuvo demokratijos, nebuvo tokios viešosios erdvės, kur galima būtų laisvai diskutuoti apie praeitį.
And we know now from the real facts that some Nazi perpetrators actually escaped from justice by taking on the new identity, moving secretly from the western part of Germany into the eastern part of Germany and re-establishing themselves there.
Ir mes taip pat žinome, kad dalis nacistinės politikos dalyvių, jiems pavyko pabėgti nuo teisingumo, nes jie išvyko iš vakarų Vokietijos į rytų Vokietiją, pasikeitė tapatybę ir save iš principo perkūrė.
Russia never has been divided and never had enough courage and enough intellectual honesty to look the history into the eye.
Rusija niekada nebuvo padalinta, niekada neturėjo drąsos ir intelektualinio nuoširdumo pasižiūrėti tiesiai į istoriją.
And it's interesting to observe how people who are intellectually very bright, who are well versed in all contemporary theories of decolonial studies, of new anthropology, of all kind of decentral approaches, they still were enchanted and made excuse or exclusion for the Russian cases as not belonging to these theoretical frameworks or not fit into the questioning, let's say. For example, there was really something which Russian intellectual would object more fervently than applying decolonial studies to the Soviet Union.
Įdomiausia, kad daug intelektualių, protingų žmonių, mokslininkų, jie labai stengiasi, kad visos šitos decentralizavimo, dekolonizacijos prieigos, jos negaliotų Rusijai ir mažiau kas rusų intelektualus sutindavo, negu bandymas pritaikyti dekolonizacijos terminą ir prieigą Sovietų Sąjungai, Soviet Union, right? Sovietų Sąjungai.
So some ethical questions which were huge, they were like elephants in the room, but nobody actually posed them.
Tai buvo didžiuliai etiniai klausimai, kaip drambliai kambariuose, kurių niekas neišdrįsdavo užduoti.
And I understand also that 1990s as an epoch in Russian Federation were not only the trauma of being born as a new state, but also was a trauma, a collective trauma of economical hardships and strategies of survival.
Ir 90-ieji Rusijos federacijoje buvo viena vertus trauma kaip naujos valstybės atsiradimas, bet taip pat tai buvo trauma išgyvenant ekonominius sunkumus.
And at the very beginning of Putin's ascendance to power, he was behaving politically as a character of some old joke. He was listening to one side, for example, dissident side, and he was saying, "You're right. How much money do you need? Get it." And he was listening to some Russian nationalists of the late 19th, early 20th century like doctrine, and he was listening to them and saying, "Oh, your white generals or your white army legacy, that's beautiful. How much money do you need? Get it."
Ir 90-aisiais Putino iškilimas į valdžią yra kaip senas anekdotas. Jisai viena vertus jis bendraudavo su viena ir kita pusė. Jis sakydavo disidentams, puiku, ką jūs darote, kiek jums reikia pinigų, štai imkite, darykite, ką norite. Ir taip pat sakydavo kitai pusė, rusų nacionalistams sakydavo, žinoma, kaip jums padėti, kokių jums pinigų reikia, imkite ir pirmin.
And he was particularly interested in all figures which were somebody else, but also Soviets. Like in Ukrainian case, Sofia Rotaru. You knew her during the Soviet late cultural time, and she not only survived, she was supported to stay active for very long time, for more than 30 years. And the same with Alla Pugacheva, Philippe Kirkorov, and all these other people. Why? Because the intuition was, and I think it was right, it will be a binding cultural space.
Ir jis taip pat ypač domėjosi veikėjais, žmonėmis, kurie reprezentavo iš principo sovietinę kultūrą. Tai Ukrainoje tai buvo Sofija Rotaro, kuri liko 30 metų.
Yeah, actually representing a particular minority within Ukrainian cultural milieu, which was Bessarabia, and it's closer to Moldova, and by origin she actually is Romanian, but yeah, it's another story.
Tai Sofija Rotaro, jinai iš principo reprezentuoja mažumą Ukrainoje, jinai rumunų kilmės, jinai ir kilusi iš Besarabijos teritorijos. Tai be Sofijos Rotaro Rusijoje taip pat turime Filipą Kirkorovą, Alą Pugačiovą. Tai yra tie žmonės, kurie įkūnė sovietinės valstybės tęstinumą.
Yeah, and I think, well, it's not popular anymore, and probably for good, the question of identity. But I think that attitude in the Russian studies, in the Slavic studies, was that everybody from the Soviet Union, it's actually a Soviet citizen.
Tai dabar jau tapatybės studijos galbūt nebėra tokios populiarios, bet slavistų laukuose kiekvienas, kuris buvo iš Sovietų Sąjungos, buvo suprantamas, laikomas kaip Sovietų Sąjungos piliečių.
Yeah. So Russian language and Russian culture is a must, as a common ground.
Rusų kalba, rusų kultūra yra pagrindas, visi turi ją išmanyti.
Whenever I went as a poet during last 20 years, I was asked who of Russian poets influenced me.
Per pastaruosius 20 metų, kai aš tik tai vykdavau kur nors kaip poetė, manęs kiekvieną kartą buvo klausima, kurie rusų poetai mane įkvėpė.
Yeah, but my understanding after very long years of research is that Soviet identity was complex in itself. There were people which were Soviet, so not only living in Soviet Union, but genuinely supporting it. There were people who were living in the Soviet Union, but were anti-Soviet. They were rare, and you know the names in your own culture. They are really, really rara avis, but thanks to them, you have independence and we have independence now. And in the middle, and this middle is huge, there were people which were living in the Soviet system, but they were non-Soviet. And they were thinking of themselves as not entirely belonging.
Bet aš taip pat suprantu, kad Sovietų Sąjunga nebuvo vienalytė ir kad mes turėjome 3 skirtingas žmonių grupės. Viena vertus mes turėjome sovietinius žmonės arba žmonės besilaikančius sovietinių nuostatų, kad jie palaikė Sovietų Sąjungą, tikėjo sovietinių projektų. Jų nebuvo labai daug. Kita dalis buvo antisovietinių pažiūrų, jie priešinosi, jiems nepatiko, jų irgi nebuvo labai daug. Viduryje mes turime didžiausią grupę žmonių, kurie nesipriešino, jie gyveno Sovietų Sąjungoje, bet jie nebuvo sovietiniai žmonės, ta prasme, kad jie netikėjo turbūt to projektu.
I don't follow them closely since maybe 2014, but before that I didn't know any one Sovietologist or Russian studies guy or girl who would approach the topic from this perspective, studying Soviet culture, Soviet phenomena, which were placed in the Soviet circumstances historically, but they were non-Soviet in principle.
Ir aš dabar jau nebelabai seku sovietologų diskusijas, bet iki 2014 metų aš nesusidūriau su sovietologais, Sovietų Sąjungos tyrinėtojais, kurie taip galvotų apie sovietinę kultūrą, kad tai buvo žmonės, kurie atsidūrė sovietinėje realybėje, bet patys visai nenorėjo būti sovietiniais.
And just to recall one important instance, one important example of this post-Soviet tensions, after Soviet tension.
Ir noriu prisimenu vieną pavyzdį, gerai iliustruojantį šitas posovietinės įtampas.
Some of you probably know about Viktor Yushchenko, the former president of Ukraine, which was, presidential elections on the year he was trying to get into the office were rigged, and Ukrainians made a kind of a carnival revolution to have a third round of elections to be under the foreign observation and to ensure that it is clear and honest. And in this third round of election, Yushchenko actually has been re-established as a winner of the presidential run.
Turėjome mes tokį prezidentą Viktorą Juščenko, kai jisai kandidatavo rinkimuose, rinkimai buvo suklastoti, tuo metu Ukrainoje kilo karnavalinė revoliucija. Ta prasme, kad buvo reikalaujama trečio rinkimų raundo, kuris būtų prižiūrimas užsienio stebėtojų. Ir taip ir įvyko ir jis buvo išrinktas prezidentu.
So Ukrainians were in principle serious about democracy, and the revolution was called Orange Revolution, which actually it was not a revolution sensu stricto, but it was called Orange Revolution. And in Russian it was mocked by the phrase orange plug. And Putin has said openly that he would not allow the orange plug to enter the Russian ground.
Tai gal ir nebuvo visai Tai gal nebuvo visiškai pilna revoliucija, bet tai buvo vadinama oranžinė revoliucija. Ir Rusijoje tai buvo vadinama oranžiniu maru, kuris neturėtų pasiekti Rusijos.
Yeah. What was Yushchenko remembered for? Two things. He started decentralization.
Jisai atsimenamas dėl dviejų dalykų. Jis pradėjo decentralizaciją.
He, including that he allowed to form a cabinet of ministers for the opposition party, the party which was opposition to him, and he was a weak president all the time because he was in the presidential office, but the parliament was dominated with the rival force.
Ir decentralizacija. Ir ta prasme, kad jisai pats liko silpnas prezidentas dėl to, kad jisai leido vyriausybę formuoti opoziciniai partijai, negu jis pats iš kurios buvo.
And the other thing, he had an attitude to the memory politics.
Ir jis taip pat turėjo požiūrį į atminties politiką.
And he promoted memory of the Holodomor, of the big famine, into the national scale.
Ir jisai paskatino Holodomoro atmintį iki nacionalinio lygmens.
At the time, he ate up a lot of critic.
Tuo metu jisai susilaukė daug kritikos.
And the major part of that critic was, you want to represent Ukrainians, new Ukrainians, as victims of history.
Ir pagrindinė kritika buvo, kad jūs norite reprezentuoti, atstovauti naujiesiams ukrainiečiams, kurie yra istorijos aukos.
But Yushchenko was quite correct, saying that we have to come to terms with the phenomenon, and we have to come to terms with the fact that the way of life was destroyed. It's not only separate lives which were lost, who perished. It's not only suffering on the scale of families, of villages, but the way of life was destroyed. And this next couple of generations of Ukrainians were quite disoriented, traumatized, and silent about the trauma. So it's time to talk, because all the elderly people, like babushkas, like those grannies in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, they still can talk. Let's try to reestablish this family, simple, very trustful talk, and it will be healing.
Bet jisai sakė, kad mes turime su tuo susitaikyti, per tai pereiti. Mes turime suprasti, kad tai buvo ne tik kaimų ar šeimų, sunaikintų kaimų ar šeimų likimai, bet tai taip pat buvo sunaikintas gyvenimo būdas. Ir tai reiškia, kad kelios kartos iš eilės buvo traumatizuotos, jos negalėjo kalbėti ir mums reikia pradėti pagaliau apie tai kalbėti.
But the guy in Kremlin was also serious about memory politics.
Bet vyras Kremliuje taip pat buvo labai nepatenkintas atminties politika.
And when they met first, Putin was trying to poison Yushchenko to the death, and Yushchenko accidentally survived.
Putinas bandė Yushchenko nunuodyti ir atsitiktinumo dėka Yushchenko išgyveno.
It was another elephant in the room. It was not possible to tackle who was the part in charge. So we understood this poisoning as a kind of a natural disaster.
Tai buvo dar vienas dramblys kambaryje, nepavyko nustatyti, kas buvo kaltas dėl šito nuodijimo ir dėl to buvo priimta, kad tai yra natūrali gamtos katastrofa.
And when they first met in person as president of Ukraine and president of Russia,
ir kai jie pirmą kartą susitiko kaip Ukrainos prezidentas ir Rusijos prezidentas,
I would give a couple of my years of life to be in that room.
Aš atiduočiau kelis savo gyvenimo metus, kad būčiau galėjusi būti tame kambaryje.
Putin had one question to Yushchenko and Yushchenko had one question to Putin on the scale of the memory politics.
Jie vienas kitam turėjo po vieną klausimą apie atminties politiką.
Putin wanted that in Poltava there will be a great celebration, huge celebration of Poltava battle.
Putinas norėjo, kad Poltavoje būtų didelis šventė Poltavos mūšio proga.
But the fact is that it's Peter the Great who won at the time, but Mazepa, a Ukrainian guy, actually lost.
Bet situacija tokia, kad Petras Didysis buvo tas, kuris buvo šito mūšio laimėtojas, bet Mazepa, ukrainietis, buvo pralaimėtojas.
Because he sided with the Swedish king.
Nes jis palaikė Švedijos karalių.
So for Ukrainians to celebrate the Battle of Poltava was awkward at least.
Tai ukrainiečiams švęsti Poltavos mūšį buvo, švelniai sakant, nepatogu.
But Yushchenko agreed. He explained a little bit of the context to Putin, but he in principle agreed that Russians will come, that they will have their own celebration, that there will be a conference between Ukrainian scholars and Russian scholars about the events of the past.
Yushchenko gal nebuvo labai patenkintas, bet jisai sutiko ir sakė, tai gerai, turėkime šventę, turėkime konferenciją, kur mokslininkai susitiktų ir galėtų diskutuoti praeities klausimais.
Yushchenko had a counter question to Putin about the Holodomor.
O Yushchenko tada turėjo klausimą Putinui apie Holodomorą.
Yeah, because what was the official Russian politics, there was no Holodomor as such.
Nes oficiali Rusijos politika buvo, kad Holodomoro nebuvo.
They were just some hardships with food supply.
Tiesiog buvo...
And the bad harvest, that was an euphemism to say what was happening.
Rusijos politika buvo sakyti, kad tai buvo tiesiog sunkumai susiję su maistu ir dėl prasto derliaus.
And Putin asked, what do you want?
Ir Putinas paklausė, ko jūs norit.
And Putin expected that Yushchenko will talk about reparation, compensation, anything.
Putinas tikėjosi, kad Yushchenko kalbės apie reparacijas, kompensacijas ir panašiai.
And Yushchenko said, I want the evil to be called the evil. The evil to be called the evil.
Ir Yushchenko pasakė, kad aš noriu, kad blogis būtų pavadintas blogiu.
And Putin replied, it will never happen.
Ir Putinas atsakė, tai niekada neįvyks. Thank you. I do see that we are out of time. It was great discussion. It was really interesting to listen to your presentation and also to the answers to these tricky questions. Ačiū labai. Šitą sesiją uždarome. Mm.